With that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Michael Nayak, who will be our first keynote speaker for today.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be the first talk of this wonderful event. I'm really pleased to be here. All right, guys, let's see. I talk fast. I've got a lot of material to cover that I hope you'll find intriguing, so we're gonna go right up until the bell for the coffee break, and I invite you to please find me all day sitting right there with any questions that you have. I will be disappointed if I don't stir at least some controversy as I build toward my conclusion today. So let's start this thing off with a bang. So as a technologist in general, and specifically in my job as a DARPA program manager, my fundamental goal is to start creating a different future today, even if I may never see that future. And so the lens that I'll bring to today's talk, my provocation, if you will, is this. If we were going to leave this room today and be biased to action and do something to get us going, then what plan might get us looking around at each other and say, what are we waiting for? Now that is a specific provocation that I attempted to answer at DARPA for a different application. I was seeking to answer the question of what are we waiting for and what's the plan to get there for seeding the first ever off-planet economy. I found myself a little frustrated at the snail-like pace with which NASA was inching back toward the moon. It kind of seemed incompatible with the hundreds of new space companies and billions in venture capital that was flooding the space marketplace. Did I lose the slides? Great. All right. And so anyway, I wanted to do something to address this, but that's not a technical problem. Of course, we've had the technology validated since the 1960s. What we don't have are aligned incentives, and so I want to talk about that because NASA doesn't have a reason to go fast to get back to the moon. If they take risk and it doesn't work out, then they could lose funding, they could lose reputation. They are disincentivized from a bias to action. And so when you look at it that way, perhaps the pace of the Artemis program is not that surprising. So a technical DARPA investment was not going to change that. New technology would actually make risk-averse people go even slower. And so what we needed was an economic investment. So I started two programs, Luna 10, or 10-year lunar infrastructure, aimed to target and design a future that moves away from a paradigm where each piece of equipment going to the moon has to be totally self-sufficient, bring its own power, comms, mobility. Instead, it looked to the creation of lunar infrastructure, commercial infrastructure, that could enable commercial services like power, comms, mobility. Logic was a companion program that aimed to bring together government, industry, and international stakeholders to define interoperability standards for those power, comms, and other infrastructure systems so they could all work together. Now, if you're interested in learning more about that, it's all in a book that has just been published by Air University Press. Just Google that phrase, Lunar Economy Field Guide, and you'll find a free PDF of the book with all the gory details. That's not what we're here to talk about. However, the lessons learned from those programs are why I believe that economic guiding principles have to go front and center if you want to create a real plan for an area in which there is no significant government activity. And Interstellar is a much bigger goal than the moon. Extremely high technical risk, extremely long timelines, $1 trillion price tag. So if we don't have aligned incentives, I argue there's no plan that will stand the test of time long enough in order to be successful. Now, outside DARPA, I'm a science fiction writer, and in my novels, I look at the world we have today, and I add one flight of fancy. Then I explore how that flight of fancy changes the way we interact with each other. And I mention science fiction because when we look at a problem as big as interstellar travel, a lot of us, even scientists like myself, tend to take at least one flight of fancy. You know, how many science fiction movies do that thing where they fold a paper on itself and they say, well, instead of just going the long way around, we'll just take a shortcut through a black hole. That's cool in Interstellar, but that's a flight of fancy that ignores that it will take an infinite number of years to traverse the singularity as time relativistically stretches. It ignores the fact that you'd need to build a vehicle that can withstand crushing forces that would successfully crush our sun. So we will invoke no new physics in our plan today. We do need new propulsion, however, there's no doubt about that. But we need to see our way there from engines that exist today. So no warp drives or impossible drives. And finally, I hate to say this, if a majority of tax-paying Americans can't be convinced that going to the moon or Mars is a truly important thing, then they are not suddenly going to be convinced that going to another star system is a truly important thing. And that's a flight of fancy that most of us who work in space are guilty of. We want to assume the average taxpayer gives a crap, when in fact they just don't see the return on investment, or the ROI. They don't see it because it doesn't affect their bottom line. And so if you remember, nothing else from this talk, I hope you'll remember this. The solution to the interstellar problem will always be more than technology. We need economic realism that a room full of sponsors can put their money and reputation behind to actually get something real built. So I'll talk about that. Now, when I was a PhD student, I took this class called Order of Magnitude Analysis, probably the most useful class I've ever taken. I use these principles pretty much every day when someone pitches me an idea as a DARPA PM. You find the relevant independent variables that underlie the problem. Then you use dimensional analysis to derive how those variables scale and balance. The idea is educated guesswork. We're not looking for precision. We're aiming to get within half an order of magnitude, or within 3x of the right answer. And at DARPA, this is pretty important. There are lots of problems that we could spend money on. If I want to pitch a program, I need to be able to show that some claim, some new insight, is capable of leading to a 10x or 100x improvement in some variable that we agree matters. And so I'm going to bring that method to what I derived today. Can I convince some of you? I probably won't convince all of you, and that's okay. Can I convince some of you that to first order, we have a plan that's actionable? So let's find out. Now, the title of the talk is Applying the DARPA Method to Becoming an Interstellar Species. So let me tell you a little bit about the DARPA method. First, while this talk leverages what I've learned over the last 4 years at DARPA, this talk is not given on behalf of DARPA. In fact, I will actively argue that you don't want any government agency involved at all. But the way in which my argument is constructed is rooted in the technological philosophy of one of the most disruptive research agencies in the world. And DARPA has this unique charter, pivotal early investments that change what's possible. Possible where? Anywhere you can argue that disruption is possible. And you can see a few of our most famous examples on the screen. The point of showing you this is to say there's a model that has allowed this repeated innovation. And it works really well when paired with big problems that have no obvious solutions. And so this multi-step method is the way that DARPA uses to boil down large visions into concrete, actionable technology steps that can actually be measured. So we can say, hey, is this still worth investing in? Now, I haven't used these Heilmeier questions anywhere except DARPA, but I believe it's a useful way to frame any technology problem and tune it for impact. And so I'll use this today. H1, you'll hear me reference these numbers a fair amount. H1, what are you trying to do? Describe with no jargon what your end state is. H2, how do we do this today? And more importantly, why and against what technical measure are we plateaued? Where do we need a breakthrough? For Interstellar, propulsion comes immediately to mind, but as I'll hopefully show, I don't believe it's either the full problem or the full solution. H3, this is the new insight. If I were a tech CEO pitching you for money, this would be the thing I have that my competitors don't. Could be materials or algorithms or the crossing of two disciplines to find some new technical insight. This last question, H8, this is the shotgun question. Do I need to kill this? Are we still making forward progress? And if so, how much? But for today, I'm actually going to argue that H4, who cares and what difference will it make? That is actually the most important question. So with that, let's get started. Defining the H1, though that seems easy for this community. We're trying to go to the stars, right? So, do we have a transport problem? I want to get something, some undefined cargo, from here on Earth out there to a star. Great. If it's a transport problem, then I can already tell that my H3, my solution, will have to be propulsive in nature. But cargo could be anything. Can a collection of photons be cargo? How about, a little chip, something the size of my thumbnail? Can that be cargo? And if so, then could this be the answer? Well, some of you in the room are well familiar with this. This is Breakthrough Starshot. You fire a huge laser, huge, much bigger than anything we have today, and we push a very light laser sail out into the cosmos, and attached to that sail are tiny chip-scale femtosatellites called chipsats, just about that big. These chipsats would hopefully send back to Earth a picture of our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, and any planets in its vicinity. Now, this is a hard problem, but this solution physically cannot scale to anything like human transport, because, I mean, human transport is what we're after, right? Humans are social creatures, so it's not a single human. We need to sell multiple so that the humans we send don't go insane. So our vision is to transport multiple humans from the vicinity of Earth to the vicinity of another star, but not just any star. Because I have human cargo aboard, now it needs to be a potentially habitable exoplanet. Now this H1 both broadens the aperture and makes it more specific. As in, now if you were thinking like a DARPA PM, you would apply an H4 caution here. You would say, hold on, why exactly do I need humans? And that's a fair question because it makes things so much harder. Because now we can't pull a breakthrough starshot. The Starshot chipsats actually had no way to stop once they reach their destination. They take their picture and just go screaming past into the great cosmic void beyond. This H1 of humans on board means we can't fly by the star. We have to accelerate away from the Earth and then decelerate into orbit around a new star and a new planet. And this is a huge, huge mass penalty. We also have to assume a habitable planet exists. And does it? Well, let's take a quick look. The closest star to us is Proxima Centauri, 4.2 light years away. It's a faint red dwarf, which is actually not an ideal star for habitation. Because of the nature of a red dwarf, this planet, Proxima Cen-b, actually experiences between 2,000 and 10,000 greater solar wind pressures than on Earth. So if it ever had any atmosphere, that's been stripped right off. Other planets in this system are either too close to the sun, so too hot, or at distances far enough where it doesn't have to worry about that killer solar wind, but it's too cold for liquid water to exist on the surface. All right, one step outward, but same star system, Alpha Cen, 4.4 light years away. It does have a potentially habitable planet. Binary stars in general are great because they sweep out large habitable zones. But let's pause here for a minute to consider that this planet in the star system that is nearest to us is still unconfirmed. We have yet to directly image an exoplanet that is not self-luminous. We only have transmission spectroscopy or reflected light detections, which is why these are still candidate planets, and this problem gets worse the farther out you go. All right, so far I haven't told you anything you don't know yet. The next stars are very similar. Sub-brown dwarfs, red dwarfs, flare stars that would actually sterilize any planet or spaceship in its vicinity. Sirius is an example of a binary, which would be a good thing, but it has no planets. That's because Sirius B is a white dwarf, so it's the dense collapsed remnants of a star that has run out of nuclear fuel. Just 120 million years ago, geologically very recent, it was a massive red giant, so it has eaten up any planets that might have existed. Okay, we have to go all the way to 12 light years away to find our next candidate. Tau Ceti has 4 planets, 2 potentially habitable. If Tau Ceti E is confirmed, then it's probably going to look more like Venus than Earth. Tau Ceti F, though, comfortably in the habitable zone. Since it doesn't sit around a binary star, it might actually have moons that are long-term stable for tides. All of that just serves to baseline 2 things. 1, how little we actually know about planets that are in star systems closest to us. Missions like the upcoming Roman Space Telescope, if that goes forward, will help answer some of those questions. But the more important takeaway is, inside 12 light years, 70 trillion miles, there are just 3 candidate planets that are potentially habitable. The good news is, because these are actually within 3x distance of each other, order of magnitude suggests that we don't need different technical solutions for each destination. If we can solve one, we can solve the other. So we have 2 targets, 4.4 and 12 light years away. If I make the very generous assumption of travel at 1/10 of the speed of light, or 0.1 c, I'm looking at a minimum of 80 to 180 years. It's actually much longer because of acceleration and deceleration times, but order of magnitude, you're looking at 100 years. So here's the takeaway from that. To sustain research and investment across that long a time period, that who cares, the H4 has to be incredibly strong. We'll come back to that. Okay, next, let's get into some order of magnitude analysis to suggest and understand what scales. I talked about scaling. What scales the mass of spacecraft when those spacecraft are designed to carry a small crew? No more than 10 people. This is bare bones exploration. So a number of people along the x-axis. I started here with the Mars mission estimate, since it's well understood, just to see if that order of magnitude math holds up to something that's actually been detail designed. So what I'm showing you here is scaling with crew on board increasing along the x-axis for an interplanetary spacecraft. We're not even to interstellar yet. So this is a 900-day mission, 2.5-year round trip. The structural mass is the orange bar. The blue is food and water and gases to produce bulk consumables to keep humans alive. There's a thin line for environmental control and life support system, barely visible. ECLIS doesn't really significantly grow as you add a few more people, at least not when compared to everything else. Yellow is the big one. This is passive radiation shielding to reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure. At 0.1 C, even a dust particle is a huge impactor. And the pink is contingency margin. That's just 20% of whatever the total is, just to capture second-order factors. So for 8 to 10 people, you're looking at 400 to 500,000 kilograms. Order of magnitude, a similar robotic mission, so something that doesn't need habitable volume and ECLIS and artificial gravity and radiation shielding, at least as much radiation shielding, that's 5,000 kilograms. So 2 orders of magnitude lower. It's so low it actually doesn't show up on this scale. The takeaway is human-specific subsystems, in particular radiation shielding and consumables, that quickly dominates the mass budget for long-term missions. If you put a human on board a ship, you buy a massive engineering problem immediately. Okay, next, let's talk about Interstellar. Once again, I'll root my order of magnitude analysis in work that's already been done. Most of you in the room are clearly familiar with Project Daedalus, or perhaps Project Icarus, which followed it. Daedalus was a feasibility study by the British Interplanetary Society to design an unmanned interstellar probe. A flyby mission, so just one way, so that's what accounts for the major difference between the numbers on this slide versus the next slide. Purely theoretical, never built anything, but it remains one of the most detailed engineering studies on interstellar travel. But not everything was perfect. On the bottom left, you can see my assessment of its realism based on what we know today. You can see some of their flights of fancy in red. For example, they assumed we could mine helium-3 for fuel from Jupiter. That itself would be a massive undertaking and a time-consuming prerequisite, meaning we couldn't even get started on Interstellar until this robotic infrastructure around Jupiter existed. Their engine design was designed as near future, quote unquote, but the fact that the study was done in the mid-1970s and it's 2025 and this engine doesn't exist probably suggests it wasn't all that near term. But to get up to 12% of the speed of light, or 0.12 C, they assumed a 2-stage rocket using ICF, so inertial confinement fusion. What this is tiny pellet mixtures of deuterium and helium-3. They would rapidly heated to fusion using electron beams. This is the same physical principle that's behind fusion experiments that occur about once a year at the National Ignition Facility, or the NIF. Except Daedalus imagined doing this several times a second continuously for many years. The NIF is also 3 football fields in size. It's kind of a one-of-a-kind facility. It has an average electrical consumption of tens of megawatts. So this is why magic propulsion is often invoked as a flight of fancy solution to interplanetary. But overall, I think they derived a reasonable estimate for a robotic interstellar one-way mission. You're looking at about 54 million kilograms, 54 tons. Now, based on what I showed you on the previous slide, you can now take this and put the human penalty on top of it. And here it is. And that is not a typo. The y-axis is in hundreds of millions of kilograms. So this is a 44-year mission to Alpha Centauri, 25% mass margin, I assume 0.1 C, so almost the 0.12 that Daedalus did. This analysis actually includes all of the factors that I showed you before. It includes structural mass and ECLIS and artificial gravity and radiation shielding, but you see only one color. This is the beauty of order of magnitude analysis. It really highlights what's important. The control variable is clearly propulsion mass. Fuel. Adding fuel to decel is a massive penalty, and fuel in general, it only scales with the number of humans on board, and therefore the size of the ship itself. And this is why Breakthrough Starshot and Daedalus assumed a flyby. So here's what I've covered so far. Considering how long this will take, the economics have to be part of the solution to actually get to the finish line. Humans are hard to keep alive for interplanetary missions, and the mass to do so is a fundamental bottleneck that translates into these infeasible propulsion masses. We need a way to rethink the solution that reduces the mass problem. I'll talk about this more later, but we are unlikely to find one compelling H4, one compelling who cares, that is worth $1 trillion in investment. Arguably, if there was one, we'd have it already. So what that means is we need to keep several secondary H4s alive, and I'll talk about this more. Things that could be valuable along the way that still allow us to close on our goal. Now we get to the fun part. At DARPA, everything I've just described would be the build-up, the setup to a wicked hard, challenging program. The key is the what if, the light bulb that says, wait a minute, if you do that, then maybe you have a snowball's chance in hell of pulling this off. I should mention that most DARPA programs fail. That's okay, because it is a snowball's chance in hell. But the best insights live at the intersection of disciplines. So that's what I'll bring today. So we've talked about the problem. Fundamentally, it stems from humans on board and all the mass it takes to protect them from radiation and feed them and allow them space to live. So what if we could transport humans without all that mass on board? So let's consider briefly how we transmit information around the world today. We started with telephone, which is basically analog voice transmitted as electrical signals in copper wires. Then fiber optics came along, and that transformed communication by replacing those electrical signals with light pulses. But the only reason that took off is because we understood how to digitize analog information. Then those digital pulses of light, sequences of ones and zeros, could represent the original information and travel at the speed of light through fiber. Because light in fiber experiences much less resistance and interference than electricity and metal, they carry vastly more data over much longer distances without degradation. And so today, that's what powers the internet and streaming and voice over IP. That fiber paradigm, as you can see on the right of this slide, is in the midst of another transformation today. Laser communication, lasercom, uses the same digital encoding as fibercom, but it sends those signals, those optical signals, through free space, so air, vacuum, between satellites. And it does so using precisely aimed lasers instead of fibers. So quick way to think about it, fibers use glass as the pathway, and lasercom uses space itself. In fact, we're doing this in space today. Over 7,000 Starlink satellites share terabytes a day across laser optical intersatellite links. Trillions of photons are transmitted, and only a few dozen need to be received to reconstruct the data. So with optical detectors like avalanche photodiodes, superconducting nanowire detectors, we can reliably decode data even at extremely low photon counts. So now comes the interesting question. Can we apply the same principle to the interstellar transport problem? Our bodies are the ultimate analog information vessel. Can we figure out how to digitize it, and I'll talk about more of what's involved there, and then use lasercom to transmit it to its destination? Now let's assume briefly for a moment that it's possible to do so. This is the key insight. Now we do not need radiation shielding or food or oxygen. Neither do we need to be limited to 0.1 C in travel speed. We have turned a human body and brain into information packets, and they can ride on photons at the speed of light. Fundamentally, then, we can deconstruct the H3, that insight, into two interdisciplinary parts that go hand in hand. A biological engineering process, and that creates a digital information out of the human form. It also creates error-resistant encoding that allows the reconstruction of that digital information back into biological form. And then astronautical engineering, because you still need a spaceship at the destination with a big antenna to collect the transmitted photons and then render the digitized information. This paradigm of bio and astro is how we can break that mass scaling I showed you earlier, because you need one robotic ship, and just one robotic ship, at the destination. Once you have that, you can repeat the transport process at the speed of light over and over and over again. When we free ourselves of the need to build a human interstellar ship, we significantly reduce the complexity of the right-hand side, the astronautical engineering required. We've shifted. We have not lost any complexity. It's important to state that. We have merely shifted the complexity, but that shift puts scalability on the table. I said earlier that if you put a human on board a ship, you've just inherited a massive engineering problem. Now that's no longer the case. And what that does is allow other secondary H4s, other reasons to care, to come onto the table. Other reasons to care, red, other reasons to fund. So just one example is an inbound killer asteroid, right? Dinosaur killer. Not a problem, because now you can actually transport billions of people if you needed to. You're no longer limited to the paradigm of every 10 people take about 300 million kilograms in spaceship. But bio and astro is not the full answer. As I've been saying from the moment I started talking, you leave the economics behind at your peril. Economics must be part of the solution or it will be part of the problem. And I'll argue in this talk in just a few moments that solving the biological problem is a 100-year challenge. So we will need economic innovation to underpin and fund a 100-year science adventure without, for example, being captive to the whims of a billionaire like Breakthrough Starshot. So let's dive into each leg of that triangle, starting with biology. Let's start by breaking down what I mean when I say encode a biological brain to a digital medium. Encoding a brain means not just copying what it looks like, but how it works. Thoughts, memories, personality in digital form. And really what that is taking the entire structure and function of a living human brain and translating it into computer code. So not just taking a picture, not just what the brain looks like, but how it works, learns, remembers, feels. It's like turning thoughts and identity into data. That is an immensely complex process, especially given the state of the art of our knowledge of the brain today. To even begin, we first need to understand what makes the brain tick, physically, chemically, and behaviorally. You've probably heard of MRI scans. They're big machines that take pictures of the brain, but all they do is show us structure of the brain, like a snapshot of its shape and its wiring. What they don't show us is how the brain works in real time. Our thoughts, reactions, emotions, they happen through activity. Neurons being fired, chemicals being released, and today we don't have the ability to see that clearly while it's happening. And why? Because brains don't sit still. So while you're lying on the MRI bench, there's a lot happening that's being missed, and today's tech struggles to capture those live, active processes. And that's the code to unlocking how thoughts and reactions unfold. So we're just missing the real action today. Once you solve that, the next challenge is how does the brain actually do things? Well, it talks, but not with words. Brain cells, neurons, send messages using chemicals, not electricity. And this chemistry has a language. And this language powers every thought, feeling, and movement that we have. These neuron chemicals include enzymes, hormones, transmitters, neurotransmitters. Each act as a message between one cell to another. And this incredibly complex chemical signaling system is what translates sensory input, so what we see, what we touch, what we think, into action. So take the simple act of returning a tennis serve. That involves your eyes, your movement systems, and your decision making, and all of that is coordinated by this chemical conversation. But there's even higher function that's happening behind the scenes. Neurons take about 170 milliseconds to go from light hitting the retina to processing to conscious movement and perception. In that time, a tennis ball travels 9 meters. So returning a serve, what it really means is that a person must swing their racket based on a prediction of where the ball is going to be in the future. It turns out that only 5 to 10% of your brain's visual system is taking cues from the eyes. The rest of it is plugged into feedback from higher level regions of the brain. So to truly, encode and digitally recreate a human, we need to understand this unquantified predictive instinct. And there's a complex chemistry and chemical language surrounding it, and that changes from moment to moment. But our task gets even harder, because brains are not static. They grow, they change as we age. So from babies understanding how the world works to more environment-driven adult reasoning, the brain builds skills by learning. It strengthens useful connections. Conversely, it lets go of unused ones. And this is a process called synaptic pruning, kind of like your gardener trimming your tree to help it grow faster. Synaptic pruning shapes your skills, your memory, and your intelligence. We think it also has a role in the rigidity of our personality and beliefs as we grow older. The point is, the brain is continuously rewiring itself, and when you encode it, that rewiring ends. So it must be recreated in a way that allows that process to continue when you arrive at your destination. And that means understanding how brains learn over time, not just where everything is today. So we need to model growth. How people learn, how they change, how their life experiences shape your unique understanding of the world. So imagine, waking up in orbit around Alpha Centauri. This collective model is all you will have to rely on to help you grasp a completely alien environment that, to your mind, you were transported to instantaneously because nothing changed while your photons were in transit. This means a key challenge is understanding what biologists call connectomics, mapping the brain's wiring over time to understand how memories are built and stored. As you can see by the million billion number there on the screen, this is an immense computational task. For comparison, an IRPA program called Microns aimed to map a complete mouse brain. It cost about $100 million and mapped 70 million neurons and just mere billion synaptic connections. We need a million billion. Once we do all that, we need to encode personality and memory. You are the sum total of your experiences, everything you've seen and felt and remembered. Our identity isn't just DNA or brain structure, it is shaped by what happens to us. Environment, stress, love, culture. We have to digitize the difference between growing up Texan or Tibetan. The difference between being raised in a family environment where you never raised your voice to being a ward of the state. Your brain encodes from those experiences habits, preferences, emotional responses. Every life experience now becomes a connection and a chemical change, and that's what's forming memory. So to digitize the brain means capturing millions of these tiny changes and forming a billion-point index of traits and memories that become essentially a digital snapshot of you. Just the regression testing to match the digital copy to the real thing is the work of a generation. And when all of that is said and done, perfect replication is impossible, actually impossible. Even fiber transmission misses data. On a VoIP call, every now and then you hear a voice turn into an electronic sound. That means that the decoding wasn't quite right. So when we get to mapping every cell and every connection in the brain, we then face a huge question. How much loss tolerance captures a person? Is it 5%? Is it 20%? How much of a person can be lost before they stop being themselves, before identity breaks? And once we figure that out, how do we write and print and render the correct amount of information back into a biological brain? It gets even worse. There's one last step that no biologist has to solve. You only have to solve if you're going to space. So making some rough estimates, it will take about 20 years to create fusion engines capable of 0.025 C. I'll justify that number in a moment. It will take another 20 years to build an interstellar ship in orbit. It will take 100 years to solve the biological rendering problems that I've just discussed. The point is, the ship will leave before we fully solve the biological problem. It will carry some hardware on board, and that has to be enough to render a human once the problems are solved here on Earth. So now, in addition to all of these challenges that I've just discussed, imagine trying to recreate a human mind inside the limited, obsolete hardware of a long-departed spaceship. We'd have to simplify, repurpose, redesign. You need to decide what's essential and what can be left behind. And then print that with systems that were not initially designed for this complexity. And a poor analogy is imagine your iPhone 5 running iPhone 13 software. How slow it would be, how much it would crash. That's how far hardware has come in 10 years. Now you have to use a 100-year-old platform to print a functional version of a mind back into biology. So all these challenges suggest that we're not 10 years, we're not 30 years, we're 100 years away from solving that problem. But when you bring biology into the solution space for space, you open up hundreds of other monetizable reasons to care about the interstellar problem that have nothing to do with space. The global market for biotech is already in the trillions. It dwarfs the world's investment in space. And biotech can also deliver very large financial returns, real long-term upside, especially for novel therapeutics. So if you can digitize a body, you can free it of cancer. Just that one bet is worth trillions in market share, and every tax-paying person on the planet cares about it. So furthermore, biotech returns are known to be lumpy. A few big winners, but many failures. And so biotech investors are actually more risk-forward and more prone to patient capital than any space investor I've ever met. So my call to space people is put bio front of mind when you're thinking interstellar. All right, let's pivot now to astro, and this section will be the shortest, simply because this audience is familiar with most of it already. We need to build a ship, a robotic ship, to take an antenna to Alpha Centauri and Tau Ceti, but it is now 3 orders of magnitude easier, not to mention cheaper, to design, build, and launch a robotic antenna ship compared to a human generational ship. So here's the state of art for propulsion of that ship. The fastest human-powered spacecraft with chemical propulsion won't cut it. DARPA investigated nuclear thermal propulsion with the Draco program. The program was canceled, but even if it had flown, it would have taken nearly 100,000 years for a one-way trip to Alpha Cen, so that won't cut it. For a plan that's actionable, we can't wait around for magic propulsion either, so no antimatter drives, no reactionless inertial propulsion, and definitely no M drives. As with the bio-insight that harnesses the motivated financial ecosystem of biotech, the propulsion system can harness the similarly growing ecosystem of fusion for terrestrial energy. There is one company, Pulsar, that claims it's building a fusion rocket that can get up to 100,000 miles per hour, still about 1,000 times slower than 0.1 C. And this company is yet to go to space, but at least it's not magical thinking. It's not a flight of fancy. 500 to 600,000 miles per hour may be within reach with today's fusion tech. That's still 5,000 years to get to Alpha Cen. But now let's look at how that scales. So you're familiar with this now, the control variable. What I'm showing on the left graph, the y-axis is the rocket equation mass ratio, so initial mass over final mass, with the difference being propulsion mass. On the x-axis is target cruise speed, with 10 being 10% of the speed of light, 0.1 c. And what you can see is that the control variable is the exhaust velocity from the engine. When the exhaust velocity increases by 10x from 0.001 c to 0.01 c, you see a decrease in the mass ratio by almost 10 orders of magnitude, 9.5. From a DARPA perspective, this is what I'd consider a knee in the curve. We're almost on that brown line today, not quite, but almost. It's not unreasonable to think that with dedicated investment, in 20 years, we can be on another curve. And where does that get us? The right side says that if you're at a mass ratio of 10 for the rocket equation, so propellant mass is 9 times the dry mass of the payload and the structure, which is quite reasonable. If you're at that mass ratio and you're at 0.01 c exhaust velocity, you end up cruising at 2.5% of the speed of light, so 0.025 c, which is a 176-year one-way trip. If you consider that the biology is at least a 100-year problem, we are now in the realm of the possible. So lots more that could be discussed, but I'll call it there on astro. The last but crucial leg of the interstellar triangle is economics. How do we pay for 100 years of biology research, 20 years of fusion innovation, and 20 years of building an interstellar ship? So first, let me tell you how we're not paying for it. Your tax dollars are not paying for it. Now, in theory, government should be the lead investor in projects that require long-term thinking. They have unquantified results, but potential long-term benefits. That's not reality. The uncertain return for this problem, high technical risk, and the political appropriations process means there is a 0% chance that NASA or Space Force or any government agency will steadily keep investing for 100 years. And other nation spending in space, as you can see on the bottom left, is dwarfed by ours. So if we do this, it will be a private sector enterprise, not public. But the grace of a billionaire only goes so far. So take Breakthrough Starshot as an example. In 2016, Russian billionaire Yuri Milner committed $100 million to figuring out this robotic flyby of Alpha Cen with these little chipsets. There was huge fanfare at the launch. I was there. Stephen Hawking was there, more importantly. I heard them say they knew it was a 100-year project. And not even 10 years later, Breakthrough is dead. I argue it's dead because the H4, the who cares, was ultimately not compelling. A flyby gets you a few pictures at most. Depending on angle and geometry and resolution, the science you return may not even significantly advance the state of the art. You'd be better off investing that $100 million into unraveling the mysteries of the deep ocean, of which there are many. So Breakthrough failed because there was insufficient ROI. There was no return on investment for the expense that the billionaire sponsor was putting in. This was a great effort. I think it's also a cautionary tale. The economics matter, and they need to be stable across the life of the project. Otherwise, the effort will fail before it reaches its goal. So what about climate change as an H4? We all escape a drowning Earth, kind of the start to the movie Interstellar, right? And yes, there are billions of philanthropic dollars that are donated every year to work on climate change. The fact that we may destroy the ecosystem that supports every human living on Earth, that seems like a pretty compelling who cares, except two things. First, I've actually heard climate change activists push against space exploration. Oh, because going to space defocuses efforts on saving this planet. And that's really a way of acknowledging a true economic reality. There are only so many philanthropic dollars to go around. Second, as this graph shows, by some models, it may already be too late, even if we started building today, and yet we're not seeing a big push to build a ship. Okay, so what about an economic H4? Capitalists like money, right? Return the resources from another planetary system to the Earth economy. And this is the same premise that Luna 10 explored for the moon. And there is actually a lot of activity in space resources, but for that, we need to develop not just one-way accel and decel, but now two-way accel and decel. I need two ships. I need one to stay out there with the antenna and one to bring the goodies back. But actually, the real problem is one of timelines versus uncertainty. What exactly are you returning from Alpha Cen or Tau Ceti that will make my money back? Oh, wait, I have to wait 100 years for you just to travel out there, then I know the answer, and maybe then I know that I lost all my money? So research shows that the biggest venture capital home runs of all time, they did come from strong convictions and patient follow-through. But no one investing today is getting rich off of a 100-year investment. And so our problem doesn't really follow this infrastructure model. So it's not government, it's not venture capital, it's not private equity, it's not individual billionaires. What is it? It's us. And I propose that the only way that you ensure the rudder stays straight over a 200-year enterprise is a philanthropic foundation with a protected endowment that is dedicated exclusively to this goal. And there are actually a lot of examples of this approach being successful over generations in the art world. The Getty Museum in LA is founded by a trust into which Paul Getty dumped all his money when he died. And even though other people run the museum now, that vision cannot be changed. Isabella Stewart Gardner bequeathed her art collection to an endowment, charged with creating a museum out of her Boston home. That museum is still running. A study on philanthropic donations from high net worth individuals found the largest slice of donations doesn't go to art. It actually goes to funds or foundations that bring about a desired impact. Additionally, in much the same way that people who love the Met Museum in New York donate money to it when they die, there are thousands of people like you and me who care about space, who might contribute to an overall interstellar endowment. Okay, so as we have with everything else, let's do some scaling math on that. Let's make a crazy assumption to start. Let's assume over some period of time, the foundation ramps up to intaking about $500 million per year in tax-deductible donations. We'll call that year one. The first principle is to establish an endowment that cannot be touched. And so the foundation only gives out research funding and only operates from returns. The S&P 500 returned greater than 10% returns in 13 of the last 19 years. Last year was as high as 25%. So if I assume 10% scaling, then this is how the numbers scale. In 15 years, the foundation has $1.5 billion to invest in biological or fusion research. But okay, maybe you think $500 million a year is crazy, fair enough. Here's how the growth of the endowment scales with 1/10 of that, and then 1/10 of that. Building an interstellar ship is about a $100 billion enterprise, so the shipbuilding can only start when the endowment is large enough to guarantee that it'll complete on those returns. So given a 20-year build, that's about 10% of the cost, or $10 billion. So depending on the intake rate, that you can start that shipbuilding in either 2037 or 20 years later, in 2058. But this is actually conservative. This is just donations. Yes, the foundation fundraises. It seeks government non-dilutive funding. But the key to true economic success lies in this principle. The foundation owns the IP to work it funds. So across 100 years, that means the foundation invests in, and therefore owns part of, technologies like fusion propulsion, clean nuclear energy, but also being able to digitally transport humans means the face of transportation is completely changed. I can go from San Francisco to Shanghai in the same second. That will literally be the most successful transportation business ever developed. Putting my DARPA hat on, that means the potential for military funding to deliver troops to anywhere in the world instantaneously. And medical funding. You can be lifted out of bodies that are suffering from things like cancer and Alzheimer's, which just cancer is a $200 billion market today. And so adding a steady royalty or IP stream from the commercialization of the work that the foundation undertakes can significantly boost the total return. The idea is you run it like a venture fund, but one that has a 20 to 200-year payoff timeline, depending on the technology, which, by the way, is about 3 times longer than any venture capitalist wants. So while the economics start in philanthropy today, it has no investors to cash out. Everything goes back to the foundation, so it can quickly transition to self-sufficient, and that's what gives you a chance at a 100-year, trillion-dollar problem. I started my talk by saying, if we were going to leave this room and do something to get us going, what plan might get us asking, what are we waiting for? This is my last slide, and this is a snapshot of what a plan could look like, not the plan. A 200-year project run by a philanthropic foundation with a clear mandate, balancing bio and astro research and commercializing spin-off innovations. I'll leave you with this thought. When you Google the Interstellar Research Group, you see this. It may not become a reality for another millennium. And I'd love to change this thinking of not realized for another millennium. The race that's never started is never won. With a multi-generational foundation that preserves a singular vision, contribution from space nerds and high net worth individuals, and dedicated investments in key breakthroughs prior to when anyone has the patient capital to invest, you can have a ship underway in 30 to 50 years. After a 175-year voyage in 210 years, so longer than our lifetime, but shorter than a millennium, we can have the first human intelligence in orbit around Alpha Centauri. 90 years after that, Tau Ceti. That's so 300 years after we start, we have humans at 2 of our nearest stellar neighbors. At the end of the day, nobody is going to do this except you and me. As I leave DARPA in the next few months, this is something I'm interested in standing up. So if this interests you and you want to help, let's talk. My hope is that actually at the next symposium, we can hear more about the syn-bio aspect of this and make that more real, make the ties to space more foundational. The other thing is, along the way, this plan, if I can call it a plan, the fact that it can start right now means along the way, you won't just deliver interstellar transport, which means it's more than just the things that we care about in this room. You can deliver things as big in the future as freedom from cancers, new methods of transportation, an unprecedented understanding of the human brain, and engines that can colonize the moons of Saturn. That broad umbrella has room for more than just the people in this room. It includes people who care about climate and energy and medicine and charity. That broadness of umbrella is why I believe this plan might actually succeed in delivering interstellar transport. So here's my conversation. If you want to continue the conversation, thank you to the organizers for having me, and thank you for your attention. Talked fast enough for 3 minutes of questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so my question is downloading the human consciousness to a computer. Currently, we're, call it the 4th generation of computers from Babbage's early attempts to von Neumann's architecture, and arguably we could be getting close to the theoretical limits of current architecture. So in order to download the intelligence to a computer, it suggests that we need architecturally a completely radically different approach. Now, we have a number of interesting opportunities in quantum computers, but they have limitations in terms of processing, possibly organic computers, possibly fiber optics. The question isn't technical. The question is, what are the characteristics of the next generation of architecture do we need in order to facilitate downloading something as complex as the human brain or the human consciousness to a computer?
So I would argue philosophically, right? And of course, I think ultimately it might be something like organic circuits that are the answer. But philosophically, I would argue the that you want to make that computing architecture on the other end as dirty simple as possible. So I would say you want to baseline that to a modern GPU architecture. And the analogy I'll use is GPU training, right? Which is that we have immensely complex neural network models that have billions of free parameters that are then trained and digitized into a few tens of thousands of parameters that can run on a single standalone GPU. The idea is you're not capturing the full training of the entire data set, you're streamlining what is like the bare minimum of what is necessary in order to render. Now, again, that's where we start going to the technical of, well, I don't really know if it's a billion points that can be compressed to a million points. But philosophically, I would argue, you want to make the computing architecture as simple as possible and make all of the complexity Earth-based and training-based, as opposed to making the rendering system very complicated. Keeping in mind that according to the plan of Bio and Astro going side by side, the computing architecture, the day it leaves, is 179 years out of date.
Thank you.
Just a footnote. Do you know the name Paul Anderson?
I do.
Did you know that this idea of interstellar telepresence he used in 1958?
Sure, but it doesn't exist.
Huh?
It doesn't exist. The idea has been around for a long time. Nothing I've said here is new. The execution.
Well, yeah, but it was in a novel, in
Yeah.
a story, yeah. So it did occur in science fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is how do we make it real, and that's where I think the economic part of the triangle has to come in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was in Astounding called We Have Fed Our Seas, and it was...
I haven't read that particular one, but I've read some other of his
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
It was nominated for a Hugo in 1959.
Good morning, my name is Boris. I would argue with the theories of Stuart Hameroff, who I know that you're aware of, that consciousness might be non-local in the sense that we're only the transmitters and receivers of something that is being connected to via some kind of microtubules. Could you expand more on this? Thank you.
Yeah, so I cannot because we have not yet quantified, right, the exact dimensionality of that problem. Again, I would argue that if we're getting started on better understanding the human brain, perhaps we would actually have the answers to those questions. There's so many questions about the human brain that nobody is funded to answer because they don't, for example, have a direct application. I would argue this is one of those problems. If, on the other hand, you are trying to digitize an entire consciousness, you have to care about things like that, and maybe you would have an answer. At the moment, I certainly don't have one. All right, thank you for the questions. I'm around all day. Thanks.